So I went to a small high school, 3 elementary schools fed into this high school. And I get to high school, and I learned something real specific that I'll never forget. It was around March of my freshman year. I walk into the cafeteria, and I say, hey, what's for lunch? And somebody says, fish. And I said, fish again? And the person looked at me and said, well, yeah, it's Friday. And I had no idea what the person meant. See, my high school straddled 2 county lines. And if you were in one county, which 90% of us were, it's likely that you were a Protestant. If you were in the other county, it's likely that you were a Catholic. And so during Lent on Fridays, Catholics do not eat meat except for fish. My high school recognized that and was accommodating to that. So every Friday during Lent, we had fish. And it was really funny going through my sophomore, junior, senior year of seeing freshmen come in and say, why are we having fish every Friday? And it was just a moment where the fasting practice of the Catholic Church was obvious and prevalent. And fasting is something that commonly happens during the season of Lent. Now, I haven't stressed fasting yet. I haven't encouraged you to fast or anything like that yet, because I knew I was going to talk about fasting today. And so I didn't want to talk about it and feel like I bombarded you after I'd encouraged you to do so. Because when done properly, fasting fixes the fractured. We are broken. We are hurting. And fasting can help repair us. Because what fasting does is it takes something from this world and says, or something that's contrary to Jesus and says, I'm not going to participate in that. You know, I've never heard of anybody fasting broccoli, right? Because it's healthy for you. It's good for you. You can fast chocolate. You can fast desserts. You know, it's not much of a sacrifice for me to fast broccoli. And it doesn't really help me at all to do so. There's no benefit, but to fast chocolate is a way of saying, I'm not going to indulge in something that I find good, and I'm going to focus on Jesus. And that's where we have to make sure we land. If our fasting is for personal benefit, then it becomes a problem. Because if I fast chocolate because, I just need to be healthier, well, then it's about me. It's not about Jesus. It's not about how I can draw closer to Him. It's how can I benefit from this. We probably have things in our lives that we need to give up, like chocolate, pop, desserts, whatever that may be. But we need to make sure we do it in the right way. Because if we don't, we really have no purpose in what we're doing. And we find Isaiah writes about that in his book in chapter 58, where he's talking to the people of God of what they need to do in order to get right with Him. But God is giving this message to Isaiah. And He tells him, He says, shout with the voice of the trumpet blast. Shout. Don't be timid. Tell my people of their sins. Yet they act so pious. They come to my temple every day and seem delighted to learn all about me. They act like a righteous nation that will never abandon my laws. They ask me to take action on their behalf, pretending they want to be near me. God is telling Isaiah to be bold, to be loud. Now, whether we're talking about proclaiming the truth, whether we're talking about worship, whatever we're necessarily talking about, being loud isn't necessarily the point. Just being loud, making a lot of noise isn't the point of what God is getting at. He's telling Isaiah to be bold. Because the message that Isaiah had was that of a warning, that of making sure the people of God knew that what they were doing didn't please God. And the thing that comes to mind is a tornado siren. Every month we have the tornado siren goes off, and it seems about every month I think, what is that? And then it's the siren. It's a way of testing it, of making sure that it's working properly. God has entrusted His message to His people, and we need to be people who share that message as a warning at times. Make sure people know that they aren't necessarily pleasing God. Now, when we're talking to someone who doesn't know Jesus, the warning's a lot different. than of someone who does know Jesus. So there's various levels of how we necessarily approach those topics, those concepts. But Isaiah is called to be a warning, not to be showy, not to perform a religious ritual, not to get up and edify himself, but to get the people back to where God wants them to be. Because Isaiah knows, and I hope we know, we at least will admit this whether we practice this or not. A religious act, if it's about me, is worthless. Whether we're talking about going to church, whether we're talking about giving financially or serving or helping someone, if it's about me, then it's worthless. It's lost all benefit. It's lost all relevance. Because legalism distorts piety. In this, we find that God's people felt that they were pretty pious. They felt like they felt pretty good about themselves. Now, piety in and of itself is good. It's religious devotion. Rarely do we use piety in a positive way. Rarely do I hear it in a positive way. A lot of times when we think of pious or piety, we think of someone who's got their chest puffed out a little bit. I got it all figured out. I'm doing what I'm supposed to. I have arrived. That's kind of what we think of. And the people of God were having that mentality. But we recognize that we have to be careful with sin. Isaiah is dealing with an issue of people who don't think they are sinning, but they are. And so I say it's easy to recognize sin when it's bad. It's easy to recognize sin. If I lie, it's a sin. Everybody recognizes that's bad. And so we can call it sin. We can call it bad. But when the act seems good, it's real difficult to identify it as sin. Now, there's something wrong with our goodness. That's a weird thing to say. So the reality is, just by being present in a worship service doesn't mean what you're doing is good. Doesn't mean what you're doing is righteous. Because there are people throughout history, I'm confident, that have participated in religious acts, religious worship services, just to say they did. Just to look good, for people in the community to see them. Now, I think that's becoming less and less prevalent, but there are people that still do that. Well, I go to church. Well, just because you go to church doesn't mean you're honoring God. Just because you're around what God is doing doesn't mean you're actually participating in what God is doing. We have to recognize the difference. There's more to following Jesus than just fulfilling a requirement. It's not legalism. It's not checking things off a box. It's not doing these religious rituals. There's more. It's hard, at least for me, to wrap my mind around that. Because I feel I have the reaction that God's people do in the next verse, where they come to God and they said, God, we fasted before you. Why aren't you impressed? That's just an audacious statement, isn't it? Like asking God, why aren't you impressed with me? They said, we've been very hard on ourselves and you don't even notice. And so here's God's response. He tells them, it's because you are fasting to please yourselves. Even while you fast, you keep on oppressing your workers. What good is fasting if you keep fighting and quarreling? This kind of fasting will never get you anywhere with me. You humble yourselves by going through the motions of penance, bowing your head like a reed swaying in the wind. You dress in burlap and clothe yourself with ashes. Is that what you call fasting? Do you really think that pleases the Lord? At a basic human level, we recognize that it's nice to be noticed. Right? It's nice to receive attention. You know, at your job, it's nice when your manager, your employer, whoever your direct report is, says, you're doing a great job. Doesn't that feel good? And there's nothing wrong with wanting to be noticed. There's nothing wrong with wanting to do a good job and for people to notice what you are doing. But if we perform a religious ritual with the intent of being noticed, then the attention we get is the only benefit that it has. No longer does it have any actually faith-based benefit. No longer does it honor God. Now the Jews, to whom Isaiah would be writing, had one day a year where they were required to fast. It was the Day of Atonement. And that was literally the one time that every Jew had to fast. Now, there were other opportunities for them to fast, other religious times where they were encouraged to fast. They were also encouraged to fast whenever they felt compelled. So it's not as though they only could fast on the Day of Atonement, but that was a requirement for them to fast on that day. But we get the indication that God's people were fasting in a way that they were trying to buy God's favor, kind of make a deal with God. We've all done this. We've all been there before. God, if you do this, I'll do that. God, if you perform this miracle or help me in this way, then I'll really get serious about you. We've had those conversations, or at least we've had those thoughts of how can I convince God to help me? How can I get a benefit from my faith? Now, when we take a step back, I think most people recognize bargaining with God is not beneficial. If I can bargain with God, I don't know if He's the God we're serving. If I can convince God to manipulate the situation in my favor, then that's worthless. Then God He's not a God worth serving. But Isaiah is writing to essentially bad motives. The practices that the people were doing, fulfilling, weren't necessarily bad. Fasting, in a religious sense, is not bad. What he is condemning are the motives. He's exposing inauthentic religion. And I'm telling you what, our world's exposing that right now. There are a lot of people that are sick and tired of the church because of its inauthenticity. And so they say, we're just going to go somewhere else. And so there are people that continue to be part of the church who aren't living authentically, and everybody else recognizes it. And they're not getting any benefit from it. Because what was happening as Isaiah is writing, there's this, one of the Ten Commandments says, remember the Sabbath, right? And so they would take the Sabbath. They wouldn't have any work on that day. They would rest, not make money, not do all the things that they would do the other 6 days. So they would rest on the Sabbath. But what they would do the other 6 days is they would work their workers harder to recoup the lost income from that day. So was taking the Sabbath really costing them anything? It was maybe an inconvenience at best. But they were finding ways to make sure they didn't get shortchanged, that they didn't lose revenue, that they didn't lose income because of this pesky religious law. They didn't take the Sabbath, they worked around the Sabbath. So this is why Isaiah is condemning the motives, not necessarily the practice. And one of the things I think that's important for us to recognize and at least frequently or evaluate is, am I dying in my faith? Am I dead, or am I thriving and living? You know, Jesus doesn't call you to a relationship that's boring and monotonous and tedious. He calls you to a relationship that's fulfilling, that's exciting. Now, not everyone's called to go around the world on missions. But that's the God we serve. That's who Jesus, He calls us to those exciting adventures. And those exciting adventures can happen in our backyard. It can happen anywhere. So it's not a matter of geography. It's a matter of where my heart is. It's a matter of the faith, of the authenticity of my faith. Because it's real easy for people to be a Sunday morning Christian. It's real easy for people to be a follower of Jesus 20 hours a week. But you know, those other 148 hours, I'm going to do my own thing. And when we do that, we find faith that's unsatisfying. We find faith that's not fulfilling. We find faith that people say, I don't want that. That's what happens. And so the intention is really important here. Now, we have to be careful when we talk about intentions, because we know the phrase, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So following Jesus is not about just good intentions. There's got to be follow-through on that. But what was happening is that God's people were performing these religious rituals with terrible intentions. So their terrible intentions were delegitimizing the actual practices. There was no benefit in what they were doing. So we think about fasting, or what that might look like. You know, it's real easy to do what God's people were doing. Well, we're going to take the Sabbath, but we're going to find a workaround so we're not losing any revenue from it. Now, I know a lot of people in the years have decided that they're going to give up Facebook or something like that for Lent. But you know, if you give up Facebook, but just spend that extra time on Instagram, that's not really fasting. And especially because Facebook owns Instagram, but that's not the point. The reality is there's a real temptation of, I'm going to fast something and fill it with something else. Are we really sacrificing on that standpoint? If we give up coffee but drink tea, are we really sacrificing? You know, if we give up one news media and watch another news media, are we really fasting? So we have to be careful and make sure that our fasting actually costs us something. But again, we have to be careful not to tend towards the legalism side of things. Because what has to happen when we fast is we have to deny ourselves. When we deny ourselves, we allow Jesus more room in our lives. And that is what we are trying to accomplish. Because I don't care what it is, whether it's chocolate, whether it's social media, whatever it is, these are things of this world. And when we forsake the things of this world, we get more of Jesus. That's the goal. That's the purpose. Because God comes in and he tells them, he says, this is what I want when you fast. Free those who are wrongly imprisoned. Lighten the burden of those who work for you. Let the oppressed go free. Remove the chains that bind people. Share your food with the hungry. Give shelter to the homeless. Give clothes to those who need them. Do not hide from relatives who need your help. Let me read that one again. Do not hide from relatives who need your help. If we took a poll, I think there's most people would say, I've at least been tempted to do that. Do not hide from relatives who need your help. It says, then your salvation will come like the dawn, and your wounds will quickly heal. Your godliness will lean you forward, and the glory of the Lord will protect you from behind. This is fasting. This is what Jesus calls us to do, to forsake the things of this world so His kingdom is built here. You know, freeing the oppressed, freeing the wrongly imprisoned, removing the chains, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, giving shelter to the homeless. Those are kingdom-building activities. That's what they are. This is not something that the church should do because it's a good thing to do. This is something to do because it's Jesus telling the world, you're important, you're valuable. You know, the homeless, that's an easy demographic for us to conceptualize. Most people don't value the homeless at all. They're not contributing members of society. There's really no benefit of what they're actually doing in the world. But Jesus says they're important because they are created by God. They created in the image of God, so they are important. So when we fast, we are trying to tell the world that Jesus has something better for them. It's not about me. It's not about how I can personally benefit from it. And so we can come back to the Sabbath concept that God's people were distorting. The Sabbath was not about withdrawing from the world. If all the Sabbath was just getting away from work, from the world, then what God's people were doing was perfectly fine. The Sabbath is about delighting in the presence of the Lord. It's about going into God's presence and saying, this is what I've longed for. This is where I want to be. And so that's the intention we have to understand. God's people were filling the legalistic requirement of the law, but they weren't actually benefiting from it because it was all about them. It's all about what they wanted. And so fasting, what it does is it forsakes things of this world so we can see how broken it is and ask Jesus to come heal it. It starts with me. I forsake things of this world so I can experience the healing work of Jesus in my life. And then when I experience the healing work of Jesus in my life, I can go to others and help them experience it too. And you know, one of the great things about following Jesus is we don't have to get caught up in all the political mumbo-jumbo. You know, we don't have to go out there and saying we're doing social justice. We can go out there and say we're doing gospel justice. Because when the gospel justice prevails, social justice takes care of itself. But the gospel justice is all about Jesus. It's not about a political ideology. It's not about how the world thinks it should function. It's about Jesus, because we know that's what the world needs. It needs the healing work of Jesus. So when we're talking about fasting, we also have to make sure we recognize that if I fast and receive any personal benefit from it, I have to be real careful about that benefit, whatever it may be. Some people may have the propensity to go to Starbucks every day and get a $5 drink. And that's your prerogative. I'm not trying to, I see a Marine over here is probably drinking black coffee, and that's all he drinks for 50 cents probably. But the reality is some people might do that, so that's $35 a day that is saved. If I use that $35 a week, I can do math. I know I talked about going to high school. I did go to a small high school. I did learn something, but anyways, so it's $35 a week. If I use that $35 a week in ways that are selfish, is that fasting really costing me anything? Now, I may be getting into the weeds on that concept a little bit. I recognize it. But I'm just saying we need to make sure we are careful of when we sacrifice for Jesus, that we sacrifice for Jesus. That we just don't reallocate resources, whatever that may mean. So fasting is about Jesus and about denying ourselves before Him. And when we do, we can experience the healing that He provides. Because I firmly believe fasting fixes the fractured. That when we remove ourselves of the filth of this world, then we can experience the healing of Jesus. But people will notice this. Not in a showy way, not in a self-righteous way, but in a way that they say there's something different about you. I love the children's song, This Little Light of Mine. You know, I'm going to let it shine. We sing that with kids, and it's a fun song to sing. But man, talk about the practical applications for adults. That if we lived in a world where we let the light of Jesus shine in and through us, how that would change the world. Amen. It draws people. Jesus doesn't condemn people into faith. He draws them into Him. Because here's the reality, that religious rituals don't drive out darkness. Religious rituals won't get rid of the filth in the world. Only denying ourselves before Jesus will actually get rid of the filth. Will actually cleanse us of all that tries to bind us. So we use this self-denial, not in a way to degrade ourselves, not in a way to make ourselves look better, but in a way that we lower ourselves before Jesus, receive all of our validation from Him so that we can go share this validation with others. When you're talking about the poor, the hungry, the oppressed, the sick, they need the validation of Jesus that they're important, that they're valuable, that they're worth something, because in the name of Jesus they are. And that is what we are called to do when we deny ourselves of this world. But then there's this little extra footnote I think just provides encouragement to us. Because Isaiah continues on, he says, then, when you've done all this, when that's what you've done and how you've done it and how you fasted, when you call on the Lord, He will hear you. He will say, yes, I am here. And He will tell you, remove your heavy yoke of oppression. Stop pointing your finger and spreading vicious rumors. Feed the hungry. Help those in trouble. Then your light will shine out from the darkness, and the darkness will be as bright as noon. The Lord will guide you continually, giving you water when you are dry and restoring your strength. You will be like a well-watered garden, like an ever-flowing spring. Some of you will rebuild the deserted ruins of your cities. Then you will be known as a rebuilder of walls and a restorer of homes. What this says to me is that God hears sincere faith. Why that's important is because I am confident that there are Christians in this world today that are falling in the same trap that Isaiah is writing against. But there's a way back. God provides a way. If we humble ourselves before Him, if we are sincerely serving Him, if we deny ourselves before Him, He's going to hear. So wherever you are this morning, God can hear you if you come to Him with a humble spirit. If we deny ourselves before Him, God provides a way. And this light concept, the world is longing for something. People are longing for some type of fulfillment, whatever that is. Maybe you this morning are longing for fulfillment. Maybe you're going through life and you're saying, is this all this is? Is this all that I have to look forward to? There's got to be something more. And Jesus says, yes, there's more. And He hands it to us. Now, that doesn't mean life will be easy. It doesn't mean all our problems will be fixed. But we are given the light of Jesus that can help us, that can save us, that can cleanse us, that can heal us, that can fix the brokenness in our lives. But we have to be humble. We have to recognize we need this healing. We have to recognize that we are broken, but Jesus can satisfy. Now, we all have needs. We all have desires. But I stand here today 100% confident that every need we have, emotionally, physically, mentally, financially, whatever need we have, Jesus can satisfy. Without exception. 100%. So we can try to perform all these religious rituals. We can try to do all these things, but it's just going to wear us out. Being present in a worship service honors God. I believe it does. But just because you're present doesn't mean that you are honoring Him. It doesn't mean that you are where you need to be spiritually. The Old Testament gets a rap of being cold and harsh and distant. And we see this condemning, judgmental, wrathful God. Man, there's a lot of grace there. There's a lot of grace. And we see in this moment in Isaiah, God is rebuking His people, but He's saying, come back to me. If you just deny yourselves, if you quit worrying about how you're going to make ends meet, if you keep worrying about how life's going to be fulfilling, if you keep worrying about all these worldly things, you're going to find the satisfaction that you're longing for. When sincere, when we humbly come before God, when we are authentic and our desire to grow closer to Him, then He restores, He heals, He fixes, He forgives. That is who He is. He's not a God who wants to condemn us. He's a God who wants to love us. And He has a long-term plan for us. Now, if you know anything about the book of Isaiah, part of the prophecy is that there's coming destruction. But when we get to chapter 58, which is getting close to the end, we see that there's a promised restoration. So when we think of the book of Isaiah in general, you may be going through stuff. You may say, I am broken. I am hurting. But what's happening here is God is promising a future. Wherever you are, whatever you're going through, He is promising a future of healing, a future where His restorative and powerful grace just consumes all that we are. So wherever you are this morning, I want to encourage you to deny yourself, to maybe fast. Lent starts on Ash Wednesday, which was this past Wednesday. And if you haven't started fasting yet, you know what? You still can. If you can only fast starting on Ash Wednesday, then we get to the legalistic side of things. And I'm not saying that you have to fast. My point is, if we remove ourselves from the things of this world, we leave more room for Jesus. And when we do that, His healing can consume us even more. So wherever you are, I don't know what that looks like for you. What I would encourage you to deny yourself and give all of yourselves, surrender all of yourselves to Jesus.